Even as the stakes for succeeding in education get higher and higher every year, we're still choosing a mode of teaching that we know only works well for a minority of our children, and it's killing us. It's time to start talking about the most revolutionary option on the table: unleashing our superpower.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
It would be really hard to find an educational intervention that has the same rigorous research base and potential to improve student outcomes as tutoring does.
Tutoring, lots and lots of tutoring. That is going to put them way, way ahead.
I'm Giles Leeper. Welcome to Tutoring the Human Superpower. It's the podcast where we try to figure out what would it take to unleash our superpower in the 21st century. To teach in the way that we're really good at teaching and the way that kids are really good at learning. Tutoring. We need to find a way to make our children's generation smarter than we are so they can cope with the world we're giving them. Our ancestors did that for us, and I think it's urgent that we pay it forward. Everybody knows that in the modern world, parenting still has a huge influence on who actually succeeds in school and after school. We tried to build schools that can just work for all kids. I've been one of those people. But in reality, at the end of the day, we know that a lot of the educational burden still falls to parents and guardians. And I think a big part of that is because parents and guardians are in a position to harness the power of tutoring. In fact, some kids get thousands of hours of tutoring before kindergarten even begins. Parents tutor even when we don't realize we're tutoring. When I say this, I get a lot of blank looks. So today we're going to blur what I think is a false line between good parenting and good tutoring. Take this scenario, for example. You have a daughter, and she's 4 years old, and she's just been given an awesome new Lego-style robot for her 4th birthday. Unfortunately, it says it's for 8-year-olds and up, and it looks like it's something that she's going to struggle with. You now have at least 4 options. First, you could leave the present aside for a few years and open it up when she's ready. Or you could let your child open it up independently just to see how far she can get with it on her own. You could open up the present and build the robot for her without involving her at all. Or you could open it up together and commit to being fully present and supportive as she tackles the challenge herself. My guest today, Professor Stuart Hammond, has evidence that this could be a surprisingly momentous decision that you're about to make for your daughter. Okay, maybe that's just a tad overdramatic. A decision like this on any given day might not amount to much. But Hammond and his team have evidence that a pattern of decisions like this one over time probably does have a significant impact on a child's brain development. Specifically, this Lego-style robot scenario is an opportunity for something called scaffolding. Scaffolding is a deceptively simple concept in education. It basically means providing just the right amount of support temporarily for a learner to complete something they wouldn't have been able to do without help. If you chose the option where she would be completing this building challenge, but with your help, then you were choosing to scaffold for her. And that's tutoring. In fact, it's one of the most important forms of tutoring. Parental scaffolding has been shown by Hammond's team and other teams also over and over again to actually increase things like a child's working memory, their ability to control their impulsive behaviors, their ability to manage their emotions. These are all components of something we're going to learn a lot about today called executive function. Dr. Stuart Hammond is an associate professor of developmental psychology at the University of Ottawa. I spoke with him to get a deeper understanding of the true meaning of his research and what it means for us as parents and as communities who want to know what would it take to unleash our superpower. Thank you for making the time for this conversation. I've been really looking forward to it. So as you know, I read your article, The Effects of Parental Scaffolding on Preschoolers' Executive Function. So we're going to try to unpack even just the title alone.
Yeah.
That could be
plan.
Yeah. So let's start with executive function. What is it and why is it important?
Yeah. So the term executive function comes from a sort of specific perspective in psychology, using the metaphor of the computer to understand human beings. We can also use terms like self regulation, somewhat to mean the same thing as executive function. And even other people have used things like higher order thought and higher order mental functions. And in a moment, I think it'll make sense why scaffolding
Okay.
might be a good fit to talk about executive function. But executive functions are essentially the idea that, particularly human beings and even as young children, we act in the world, but at some point we get the capacity to start reflecting on our actions or changing them in some way. One big one is inhibition, so stopping something, realizing, either being told or realizing, well, this is, maybe I want to do this right now, but I shouldn't, or I need to stop myself. So that inhibition is commonly identified as an executive function. Things like working memory, so being able to retain some digits in your mind, or a task instructions in your mind, another commonly identified area of executive function. And this depends a little bit on the model where you're coming from, but the idea that there's some kind of more central workspace that serves as an organizing element that sort of says, okay, right now, because we have these rules, you need to stop what you're doing or continue, or you need to focus on this, or you need to focus on this. And that's usually portrayed as kind of a central executive. And that's really where the name executive function comes from. So the idea is there can be a variety of different functions related to this. Inhibition is really one of the big ones. Working memory is another really big one. But there's some sort of developing central executor that allows even young children, and more so as adults, to organize our behavior, to follow rules. And I mean, executive function has been used to study topics ranging from mathematics, ability to words, to playing sports, like all those rules you have to manage. So it's really seen as this core human capacity to function in a more complex way. All animals, including humans, behave in the world and act in the world, but the idea is that humans have this extra capacity to regulate their behavior in more sophisticated ways over time. And so executive function is trying to get at that.
I'm thinking back to the hiring hat that I used to wear, thinking about what we would call soft skills, things like communication abilities, attention to detail.
Yeah.
These were the things that we were kind of trying to figure out more than did the person know the job only.
Yeah. And some theorists' work, executive function is really discussed in terms of problem solving. It's interesting, we use these terms soft and it can come across a bit pejorative, but when you think about executive function as a capacity to problem solve, that's a soft or hard skill. It's very crucial and central skill.
Well, I think we've established that it's pretty important. And now we get to the part that's a little dangerous, because as parents, we have an impact on this. And it's, it gets a little close to home. When I became a parent in 2014, the idea of parental scaffolding was not on my radar. So could you talk now about parental scaffolding?
Scaffolding, right. So scaffolding, I mean, the term, I think, is, you can hear what the metaphor is, which is construction scaffolding. And the idea is, how do you build something when it isn't there in the beginning? Well, then you put some supports around it. And that's sort of the metaphor there, that it's the child or the learner, right? And a parent or someone with more expertise who can provide appropriate structuring or scaffolding to assist the child or learner to build up whatever skill we're talking about here.
I think you're maybe scaffolding for me right now, right?
Yeah. Once you start thinking about it, you sort of see it all the time and think about even, like how does someone scaffold when they're communicating with someone? Are we sometimes aware, and some people are better at doing this consciously or just sort of as part of their way of living, hey, if you're talking to someone who maybe isn't from your region, you just throw out a bunch of these acronyms for things or names, that's going to be very difficult for that person to understand. Or are you able to say, almost keep in mind, okay, well, this is where this person's at. I'll describe it this way, so they can follow along and that they're engaged. Once you start to think about the concept, you actually start seeing it arising, I think, not just in parent-child interactions or teacher-student interactions, but actually in lots of other interactions as well. Actually, you'll be happy to hear this. I believe the original paper, Wood, Brunner, and Ross, actually uses the term tutoring. And it was looking at mathematics tutoring. And that's, to my knowledge, the first time the term scaffolding was used. So very appropriate link. That's the first time scaffolding was used.
As he said, the term scaffolding in the educational sense was coined in the 1976 paper called The Role of Tutoring in Problem Solving. And I thought it was really interesting because this was not a study where researchers were trying to develop new methods for making tutoring more effective or anything like that. This was psychologists observing what tutors do automatically. And what they found, in fact, was that even if you make silly rules to prevent tutors from scaffolding, tutors are going to break them and they're going to scaffold anyway. So, in your study, what was the scaffolding that you observed?
So what we used as sort of a measure of scaffolding was we had parent and child come into a research lab. This was in Vancouver in British Columbia, and work on a puzzle that was very abstract. It wasn't a simple puzzle with, pictures on it. So even for an adult, actually, I think adults would not have a huge problem solving the puzzle, but it wasn't completely simple task. But for kids, it was a very challenging puzzle. So we sort of said to parents, well, do this puzzle with your child and try and help them solve it. But, do it as you would do a task at home. And we looked at how parents and kids did that together. And we were interested in seeing, could the child be involved? Not necessarily doing it all themselves. That would be very hard. These kids were 2 initially. We met them again when they were 3 and 4.
It wouldn't have been a good assignment if the kid could do it without the parent, right?
No. So again, this is really getting into this idea of scaffolding as the skill isn't there yet. And what are the supports being put around that sort of metaphor to allow the child to build up these skills?
The parents, did you tell them to scaffold or?
We definitely didn't use that term. We just sort of invoked, okay, you and your child are going to do this puzzle together. Have your child attempt to finish it. Kind of a system as you normally would. So we sort of used terms like assist or help. We didn't give them otherwise really explicit instructions.
I just find it interesting that scaffolding is a thing that you don't have to tell us to do. Like, we're just going to do it. You can count on it,
Yeah, and actually there's some very interesting culturally oriented research. Culturally, it seems that something like scaffolding exists across all cultures. It really does seem to be a very human activity.
According to Hammond and the scholars that he cites, scaffolding does not always look the same in every culture. There's a lot of cultural variation, but scaffolding does exist in every human culture. And this has been pretty well established not by psychologists, but by anthropologists. In a future episode, we're going to speak with an anthropologist named Dr. Shana Lev-Levy about scaffolding that she's observed among hunter-gatherer people. And as we talk with her, we'll learn why being born with this inclination to become good at scaffolding and interested in scaffolding for others has been so important to the success of humanity since our very beginning. This sort of scaffolding style of teaching is something we are basically hardwired to do. It's built into our DNA. Scaffolding could very well be like language. Humans are not born with language, but if we're neurotypical, then we are born with the inclination to acquire language. That doesn't mean, however, that we're all going to be equally skilled with language, and the same is true with scaffolding. Even though it's universal and we all do it, clearly we're not all equally good at it. And that was something that came through in your article.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the quality of scaffolding?
Quality of scaffolding, yeah. So I think if you think about it, a given task, but let's just take the example of this ring puzzle. I mean, there were some adults who essentially finished the puzzle on their own. And the child really wasn't involved in any kind of substantive way at all. Including a child in a task or a learner in a task can make the task much more challenging. You could do it on your own, right? So there is that kind of tug of war there. The idea is then, so does the child at one extreme, are they involved at all? Another possibility would be to essentially completely hands off and let the child attempt everything themselves. Now, as I've said, this particular puzzle we used in our study was so difficult for a 2 or even a 3 or 4 year old that just wasn't going to work either. If you think about it that way, of not getting involved in it at all, doing it all yourself, between that, what are some other possibilities? And I think overall, what we identified, at least in our study, as a good scaffolding strategy is certainly to allow the child to get involved with the task, the puzzle in this case, and even sort of, put their hands on the pieces, try and manipulate them, and even maybe allow them to make some mistakes. On the other hand, if you left them on their own too much, they would get overwhelmed and frustrated, have a temper tantrum, or just be totally disengaged. So it's finding this more sweet spot between, okay, I want to get them involved, keep them interested, challenged, but also not allow them to get overwhelmed. So kind of watching that frustration, and maybe sitting back at certain times, but then like a wave coming in, maybe offering some more direct support, maybe some modeling. Scaffolding is kind of it's an interaction. We used to tell our research assistants who were helping us kind of examine the videos and code this data example, that sometimes it can be a little misleading if you just think, oh, wow, this parent is really giving lots of advice. And it's almost like you could put your hand over one side of the video, put your hand over the child and say, wow, okay, this parent's really doing a lot. Oh, maybe they're a very good scaffolder. And then you take your hand off and you realize it's not working for this kid.
I really love Stuart Hammond's use of the analogy of the waves here. A good scaffolder comes in to assist and simplify, and then they recede to simply watch the learner struggle to make their own connections. But they're ready to come back in. This scaffolding wave can come crashing in with more direct and obvious support, or it can come in very gently with subtle hints instead. But whether the wave of support is appropriate and skillful or not depends on the child and how the child is responding. Scaffolding is an interaction. A tutor's decision to crash in and take charge can be good scaffolding, but only if it's clear that that's what the learner is needing in that moment. And this depends on whether the tutor is deeply understanding what is going on in the learner's mind or not. Psychologists call this ability to intuitively understand what is going on in another person's mind reading, or having a theory of mind. This brings up something that goes to the heart of what makes tutoring special, which is this theory of mind thing and this mind reading thing that happens. It seems like to some extent what you were gauging was how linked their minds were and how accurate the theory of mind was.
Yeah. That's right. Actually, it's interesting you bring that up, because this larger study really was on executive functioning, scaffolding, and theory of mind. We were looking at all of these things.
Okay.
And even thinking about conceptually, how are all these things related? Right. So you're right.
So to sum it up, if the parent was number one, willing to exert some effort to scaffold, and number two, skillfully reading their child's mind to time their waves of assistance the most helpfully, then Hammond and his team called that parent a good scaffolder. And what they found was that good scaffolders made a difference for their children's brains in the long run, which is kind of amazing considering that they just saw them do one puzzle with their child on one given day.
This puzzle, okay, we're really looking at this one small thing, but we're hoping that this is a good kind of metric for how lots of other things are happening, of how this parent and child work together normally. We found that, that scaffolding component could predict improvements in executive function and problem solving in subsequent years. And we met with these kids again at 3 and 4 years of age. So still in this younger period, but again, it kind of makes sense. The scaffolding process of managing the child's frustration and or assisting them in doing so, though, letting them experience some frustration too, for example, not being overly intrusive. Well, that's sort of building the practice of good executive functioning in the child. So I think that's why we found those connections.
And there have been other studies similar to this one, and basically they've all found the same thing. The finding that the quality of a parent's scaffolding has a causal impact on a child's executive functioning is now pretty well established. Does it seem like then that a person who is going to be a good scaffolder on a puzzle, when they're later teaching a child to take out the trash, actually more steps in that than we might think as adults?
Yeah, right.
Is probably going to be a better scaffolder when that's the task.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say that our research didn't expressly examine sort of scaffolding across content. I don't know of a study that's actually expressly addressed that interesting question.
Yeah.
Like you could imagine people in the past living their lives without puzzles and without mathematics, whereas taking care of life in a community, chores has clearly been necessary for an extremely long time before things like mathematics were invented. So although the term scaffolding has its origins in the tutoring literature and in sort of this more academic context, I think it's gradually been expanded to apply to these real life contexts and seems to fit really, really well with things like chores in the home, but scaffolding how people solve problems, whether that's a fairly abstract problem that really doesn't matter so much if you finish a puzzle or not. Your math homework is important if you're in
Right.
school and you got to get it done, and you're going to get at least in our school systems a grade and ranked in some kind of way. And then there's the life of the house or life of the community, and there's room for scaffolding there. So it makes sense to think about the concept in all of these contexts.
I guess it kind of gets to what I alluded to before about how this affected me, where I took this, because I had to sort of take it and apply it to my life. And I felt like, okay, I want to do a good job for the executive function of my children. Seems
Right.
important. So I started doing more puzzles with my kids. And I guess what kind of dawned on me as I was doing puzzles was that I wasn't just teaching them how to do puzzles. It might seem obvious to some people, but it wasn't obvious to me at the time. It was a big epiphany for me to realize that if you coach them on how to achieve one goal, then when they're trying to achieve goals and you're not there to help them achieve goals,
Yeah.
they've still got some coaching in their pocket, I guess, that I
Yeah.
can hope is useful to them.
That makes sense. And I think that's true, that I think in so many different tasks we do together with kids as parents or as tutors, it's not just the content at hand, the puzzle or reading the book together, but you're also conveying, and I think executive function is a useful way to think about this. You're perhaps building up some more general skills to the child that extend beyond the particular content or specifics of what you're doing together. I think maybe it's a good time for you just to mention that although this metaphor term scaffolding emerged in psychology in about the 1970s, the ideas related to it actually came about much, much earlier in the 1930s with a theorist, Russian or Soviet at the time, theorist named Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky is really the one who really brought psychologists' attention to what we now call scaffolding. And he really did see it in sort of the general way that you're thinking about, that it really applies to this kind of social learning and the capacity of a more expert learner to structure things appropriately for the child really has a huge impact on their learning.
If you are a parent who is right now worrying that perhaps you didn't do enough puzzles with your child, please do not let that be your takeaway from this. My wife, Christina, for example, has not done nearly as many puzzles or puzzle-type activities with the kids as I have. But since I've been paying attention to scaffolding as a concept, I've noticed that in many areas of life, she's definitely the better scaffolder between the two of us. She's quicker to pick up on authentic problems our children are having in their lives. She handles relationship problems with things that happen at school, coping with negative feelings like tiredness and boredom. She's more observant and present than I am, and so she scaffolds better about life's problems that have nothing to do with puzzles. These are not the kind of scaffolding episodes that it is easy for a psychologist to videotape in a lab, but that doesn't mean they're less important. If a child has weak executive functioning skills, like perhaps ADHD or other types of challenges, there's nothing in this research to say that that is the parent's fault for not scaffolding enough. Parents do play a role, but there are a lot of other factors as well, including biology. None of this information is meant to shame any parents or make them feel guilty, but I do think that this is important information for parents and community members who care about the success of every child in their community to be aware of. Executive function is about learning to manage your own brain to solve problems or achieve goals. Problems and goals won't always come in the form of puzzles, but they will often be frustrating. They will often require organized and strategic thinking. Impulsive decisions will usually not be the best ones. They may require communicating, asking for help when necessary. As Stuart Hammond says, it makes sense that children who experience a lot of scaffolding will become better at managing their frustration, more organized, more strategic, better communicators, less impulsive. Also, they'll get to experience success with goals that they couldn't have achieved without scaffolding. So they'll get to experience an intrinsic reward for using these executive skills. If you're a parent and you are still listening to this highly academic podcast, there's a very good chance that your children have experienced quite a lot of scaffolding, whether you were aware of it at the time or not. But I've known many parents who were raising children alone and working 2 jobs to pay the bills, make ends meet. I've also known parents struggling with mental health issues and parents who were in prison when their children were growing up. All of these things can disastrously impact both the quality and the amount of scaffolding a child might get when they're growing up. And none of these is the child's fault. The other thing that came up when I thought about this, of course, is that it has real equity connotations in that, well, we don't all get the same quality of scaffolding at home.
Right.
And yet there's a huge amount of literature out there that I have found about the impacts of executive function on how children do in school. I haven't found very much about how school affects executive function. There seems to be this idea that the executive function is the domain of the parent, and if it's not there,
Right. Well, school, although we a lot of us who have been scholarized, our families have been in the schools for many generations now, kind of forget this. School is a very unusual way to organize education. And I know from what you've told me that you found some interesting ways to break out of that and actually really transform schooling into more small group tutoring. But the default school is putting 20, 30, 40 kids of the same age in a room with chairs. It can vary a little bit, but often chairs facing forward to a single expert. And we've got to make all this work. And that, it's interesting to think about the connection of that as a kind of special problems case and all the problems that provides for kids, right? It's like sitting down for 20 minutes, waiting your turn to talk, and really connecting their executive functions to being able to follow those rules in the classroom. And so Clancy Blair and his colleagues have used this concept of school readiness to sort of, I think it's a nice bridge concept of thinking about, well, have these executive functions, have they been sort of organized in a way that they're going to meet the challenges of this special context of the modern or the mass education school? Some parents who have a strong family tradition of school and perhaps even higher education, university or four-year college and so on, probably bring a lot of this to their kids from very early in life. I think it's also thinking a little critically as well about why have we organized schools this way. There are reasons to do some of it, and maybe some of it works great, but maybe there's other things, we can change the kids, but maybe we can change some things in the class or the way we do things to kind of change the problem space a little bit.
To me, it seems like as a teacher with classes of 22 students, this kind of mind reading based scaffolding, the really sophisticated scaffolders that you saw in your study, I don't think that kind of thing was possible for me when I was a second grade teacher. I didn't feel in a position to do it. So I would circulate the room and there would be a child really struggling. I didn't have time to dive into their brain. I had to find quick solutions, bearing in mind that somebody else is also struggling.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think if you think about if good scaffolding, while it has some general principles and you can always apply those, it's not that you can't be a good teacher or include some good teaching or scaffolding techniques in a large class. But of course, when you think about how the concept is organized in this contingency and individual learning and so on, there were real limits too.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This point I'm making might get me in trouble with some listeners. That scaffolding, in its original meaning from the 1976 study on tutoring, cannot be done via traditional classroom teaching, simply because of the number of kids in a traditional classroom. Classroom teachers, as Stuart Hammond pointed out, do use scaffolds and scaffolding techniques a lot, having kindergartners write large letters instead of small ones, like we expect of older students, is a scaffold because it breaks down the challenge of writing and makes it a bit easier, more appropriate for a kindergartner. Good teachers use scaffolds every day. But classroom teachers cannot come in like a wave, perfectly in tune with the individual child's level of frustration or success. Any parent who spent as little time reading their child's feelings and thought processes as a classroom teacher can with 20 students to worry about would have been identified as a bad scaffolder in the Hammond study. That kind of scaffolding that he's talking about, the one based on mind reading and a strong theory of mind, that's what I'm claiming is not possible for a classroom teacher. But the implications of that claim are just enormous. It means that classroom teachers with kids struggling to complete a task cannot do what we know is the absolute healthiest thing to do for a child's brain in that moment: to scaffold patiently and skillfully. I have been that teacher. I have experienced having 6 of my students all frustrated at once and feeling helpless to do what I instinctively wanted to do for them. But I couldn't do what a parent can do. This is not because parents and guardians have some kind of magic that teachers don't have. Teachers just have too many kids to do the best thing for kids because we, their communities, have put teachers in that position. Now, of course, one option for those teachers is to just give kids tasks that won't frustrate them. But that also misses the point of this study, in which they deliberately gave kids things they couldn't do without scaffolding. Because avoiding frustration is also not the answer. We don't learn very much from tasks that don't challenge us. When I quit public school teaching and began to tutor 3 kids at once, I felt this wave of relief. Usually I only had 1, maybe 2 kids struggling to complete something at once, and so I could scaffold for them, even when I didn't know that what I was doing was actually scaffolding. And it made such a difference. It felt so much healthier than just letting kids be frustrated or giving them some dumbed down assignment that they could do independently without scaffolding. It made me want to give every teacher and every child that experience. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to have this conversation with me.
Hey, that was great. Thanks so much. It was a real pleasure.
At the end of interviews on this podcast, I like to offer my 2 cents about what we've learned from our expert and how it deepened my understanding of what it would take to unleash our superpower. I think it's always helpful to keep the historical context in mind when thinking about these things. And one thing that social scientists generally agree on is that historically education has become more and more important over the centuries. And this creates a burden. The need for each new generation to always be a bit more educated than their parents, just to keep up with the complexification of the world, creates a bigger and bigger burden for families. As that burden grows, the most successful communities have been the ones that have banded together, communalized important educational burdens. In the 19th century, the future was brightest for the communities that communalized primary school. It had always been a private or a family burden, but it became a shared one that the entire community invested in. In the 20th century, the most successful communities in the world were those that found a way to communalize the burden of high school. Private high schools were around, and they were funded entirely by parents. But America's success arose from being the first in the world to make high schools communal, supported by the entire community. Public. If kids are trying to accomplish something frustrating for them, the easiest route is to do it all for them or not help at all. Stuart Hammond made that clear for me. Helping kids to solve their own problems and achieve their goals that they couldn't have done without help requires patience and skill, time, energy. And for a family without much time and energy to spare, it is a serious burden. But it's important that somebody does this for every child. Executive function has been found to be more predictive than IQ of how a child will do in school. Measures of intelligence are not as important as measures of executive function in predicting who will succeed in school. Meanwhile, how a child fares in school is becoming more predictive of the quality of a person's life after school. Executive function is becoming high stakes. The decision about how much of the educational burden a community will share in or leave up to individual families is not clear-cut. It's arbitrary. Once in a while, communities step in to take on more of that burden. I believe the future will be brightest for communities that recognize that the burden of scaffolding, the burden of tutoring, must become communal, borne by the entire community, public. In order to unleash our superpower, communities will have to decide that every child in their community deserves the kind of scaffolding that can only be done via tutoring. And that's my 2 cents. I do apologize, my website was down during the last episode, but it's up and running now. gilesleeper.com is up and it has a contact me page. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. And let's stay in touch.